4 hours. That is the total time it took 7 SAS operators to enter a fortified compound defended by 400 armed men, move through its interior, locate a high-value target who had evaded 3 American assault forces across 18 months, and walk back out. Target alive, 0 casualties. Mission complete. 4 hours and 4 minutes to be exact. The compound sat on the northern edge of Mosul, in the Nineveh Governorate of Iraq. It had been a Ba'athist military installation before the invasion. After the fall of Baghdad, it became something else entirely. A command center, a weapons depot, a living fortress reconverted by Al-Qaeda in Iraq into the most heavily defended position in the northern theater. Reinforced concrete walls 2.5 meters thick, 4 guard towers operating on independent rotations, backup generators that kept the perimeter lit through power outages, and 400 fighters cycling through 6-hour shifts around the clock, every day, without exception. 3 American assault operations had been launched against that compound between July 2003 and August 2004. The smallest of those operations involved 200 soldiers and 2 Apache helicopter gunships. Not one of them had breached the outer perimeter. Inside that compound, untouched and undisturbed, was Abu Tariq al-Masri. He was not a battlefield commander. He was something more dangerous than that. Over 11 months, the network he personally architected, cells embedded across 3 northern provinces, financed through a system no coalition intelligence asset had fully mapped, had been responsible for the deaths of 140 Allied soldiers. Not through conventional combat, through IEDs, pressure plates buried in roads, devices hidden in vehicles, in walls, in the debris of buildings that looked abandoned and were not. Each device traced back, through a chain of materials, financing, and couriers, to the same source, Abu Tariq al-Masri. The American command in Mosul had spent 11 months trying to find a way in. They had satellites. They had signals intercept platforms running continuous coverage. They had a special operations task force with a classified budget that would later be estimated at over $1 billion annually. They had every technological advantage the most expensive military apparatus in human history could provide. And they were no closer to Abu Tariq than the day they first learned his name. In early January 2005, the planning chief of the coalition task force in Mosul convened a formal briefing. A British officer had submitted a proposal, a plan to enter the compound, extract the target, and exit without triggering a full defensive response. The planning chief read it, set it down, and described it in front of 14 Allied officers as, and these are his documented words, operational suicide committed to paper. 7 men against 400. The British officer did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He asked for 48 additional hours before any final decision was made. He already knew something that no one else in that room knew. He had known it for 16 days. This is the story of how 7 men walked into a fortress that 3 American assault forces could not take in 18 months, and walked back out with the most wanted man in northern Iraq still breathing. It is a story about a plan that was rejected 3 times by the same command that would later be forced to sign the report confirming its success. About a method so different from everything the American military machine understood that the first instinct of every senior officer who encountered it was to dismiss it entirely. About intelligence that was not gathered from satellites or signals, intercept platforms or classified budgets running into the billions, but from 7 men lying still in the dark, night after night, watching and counting and waiting. What happened inside that compound on the night of February 9th, 2005 was not an accident. It was not improvisation. It was not the kind of outcome that gets attributed to luck by people who were not there and cannot explain it any other way. It was the product of 19 days of silence, of absolute operational discipline, and of a calculated precision that the American command in Mosul did not have a manual to understand, because nothing in their doctrine had prepared them for it. The British officer who submitted that plan knew, from the moment he walked out of the briefing room in January, that he would not need to argue his case again. The compound would argue it for him. To understand what 7 men walked into on the night of February 9th, 2005, You have to first understand what had been built on that ground, and how long it had taken every other force that approached it to conclude that the compound was simply untakable. The structure had not always been what it became. Before the 2003 invasion, the site operated as a secondary Ba'athist military installation, a logistics and storage facility positioned on the northern edge of Mosul, unremarkable in its function, notable only for its construction. The walls were poured reinforced concrete, 2.5 meters thick at the base, built to withstand sustained artillery impact. When AQI moved in after the fall of Baghdad, they did not need to build a fortress from the ground up. They inherited one, and improved it. By late 2003, the compound had become something that had no precise equivalent anywhere else in the northern theater. 4 guard towers, each manned continuously through overlapping shifts, covered every approach angle. The perimeter lighting ran on independent generators, meaning that power cuts, common in Mosul throughout 2003 and 2004, had no effect on visibility at the outer walls. The interior was divided into operational blocks, weapons storage in one section, communications in another, living quarters for the rotating fighter population in a third. The fighters themselves numbered 400, cycling through 6-hour duty rotations that kept the compound at full operational capacity at every hour of every day. The American command understood the compound's value early. They also understood, early, how difficult it would be to take. The first assault was attempted in July 2003, 4 months after the fall of Baghdad. It was a combined operation. Infantry elements supported by armored vehicles, launched at night with air surveillance overhead. It did not reach the outer wall. The defensive response from the guard towers was immediate and concentrated, and the assault force pulled back before the breach attempt could begin. There were casualties. The operation was classified. The second attempt came in the spring of 2004. A larger force this time, with better intelligence on the perimeter layout and a more deliberate approach route. It reached within 200 meters of the outer wall before the same problem recurred. Defensive fire from elevated positions that the assault teams could not suppress, without triggering a full engagement with 400 fighters in a confined, fortified environment. The force withdrew. The operation was classified. The third attempt in August 2004 was the most substantial of the 3. 200 soldiers, 2 Apache gunships providing close air support, a dedicated signals team, and a rapid reaction force positioned 2 kilometers from the objective. It was the most carefully planned approach the task force had mounted. It also did not breach the outer perimeter. One of the Apache crews reported sustained fire from 2 of the 4 towers simultaneously, a response that indicated the compound's defenders had anticipated the approach vectors used in all 3 attempts. The assault was aborted. The operation was classified. 3 attempts, 3 withdrawals. Not one Allied soldier had set foot inside the outer wall, and inside, untouched by all of it, Abu Tariq al-Masri continued working. He had been inside that compound for 11 months by the time the third American assault failed. He did not leave. There was no reason to leave. Nothing had come close enough to threaten him, and everything he needed to operate was within the walls. He supervised personally. That was the detail that made him different from most high-value targets of that period, who delegated and distanced and moved constantly to avoid exactly this kind of concentrated attention. Abu Tariq did not delegate the things that mattered. The weapons shipments moving through the 3 northern provinces, Nineveh, Saladin, and Kirkuk, were tracked by him directly. The financing that kept his IED network operational across those 3 provinces flowed through systems he had designed and still controlled. The cells embedded in the villages and roads between Mosul and the Kurdish boundary answered, through layers of intermediaries, to him. 140 Allied soldiers had been killed by devices connected to his network over 11 months. The number was not an estimate. It was the figure the task force intelligence section had reached after tracing device materials, courier routes, and financial transfers across hundreds of hours of analysis. 140 in 11 months. From inside walls that 3 assault forces had not been able to cross. The compound was not just a location. It was the reason Abu Tariq was still operational. Remove it, and the network fractured. Leave it standing, and the count would continue climbing past 140 with the same quiet, methodical consistency it had maintained since the beginning. The American command knew this. They had known it for months. What they did not know, what no one in the task force headquarters knew in early February 2005, was that a team of 7 men had been watching that compound from the outside every night for over 2 weeks, and that those 7 men had found something that 200 soldiers, 2 Apaches, and 3 classified operations had missed entirely. Colonel Richard Haines was not a man who arrived at conclusions carelessly. He was 51 years old in January 2005. He had spent 23 years inside the American military planning apparatus, moving through assignments in Germany, South Korea, the Gulf, and the Balkans, before landing in Mosul as the task force's chief of special operations planning. He had seen plans fail. He had seen commanders overestimate their forces and underestimate their objectives and pay for it in ways that ended careers and, more often, ended lives. He had developed, over 2 decades, a particular sensitivity to the kind of proposal that looked audacious on paper and became a catastrophe on the ground. He was good at identifying that gap. It was, by most accounts, the reason he held the position he held. When the British plan crossed his desk the first time, in November 2004, he read it in full and rejected it the same day. His written assessment was precise. Insufficient force mass for the objective, inadequate contingency structure for contact scenarios, no viable extraction protocol if the approach was compromised. He sent it back with notes. He considered the matter closed. It came back. The second submission arrived in December 2004. Revised in some sections but unchanged in its central premise. 7 operators, no armored support, no air assets on station, entry through the outer perimeter on foot. Haines convened a formal review. 2 additional planning officers participated. The conclusion was the same. The plan was rejected. His written notes from that meeting described the proposal as, in his exact phrasing, operational suicide committed to paper. He considered the matter closed a second time. It came back again. The third submission was in January 2005. By that point, Haines had moved past professional disagreement into something closer to institutional incredulity. He did not review the third submission privately. He scheduled a formal briefing and invited 14 Allied officers to attend, British and American, senior planners from 3 different commands operating in the Northern Theater. He wanted the rejection documented in front of a full audience. He wanted it to be final. The briefing room was on the 2nd floor of the task force headquarters building in Mosul. 14 officers seated. The British officer presenting stood at the far end of the table. He was not a large man, and he did not speak loudly. He presented the plan methodically, without embellishment, in the same way he had presented it twice before. Haines let him finish. Then he spoke. He said, in front of all 14 officers present, that sending 7 men against 400 was, and these are his documented words, either British arrogance or British ignorance, and probably both at the same time. He said it without raising his voice. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who considers a discussion finished before it begins, who has stopped engaging with the argument itself and has moved on to the administrative reality of ending it. There was no anger in it. There was something harder than anger. There was certainty. The room was quiet. The British officer did not respond to what had been said. He did not defend the plan, did not challenge the characterization, did not appeal to the other officers in the room for a counterpoint. He sat with the same quality of stillness he had maintained through the entire presentation. Not the stillness of a man suppressing a reaction, but of a man who had already accounted for this moment and moved past it before it arrived. He made one request: 48 hours. Not to revise the plan. Not to prepare a new submission. 48 hours before any final decision was formally recorded. 48 hours to complete what he described only as additional reconnaissance preparation. Nothing further. Haines looked at him for a moment. Then he said yes. Not because he expected the outcome to change. He said yes the way senior officers say yes to requests that cost nothing and confirm what they already believe, because the British officer would come back in 48 hours with nothing new, and the rejection would be permanent, and the record would show that every reasonable accommodation had been extended before the plan was closed for good. He was not wrong about the 48 hours mattering. He was wrong about everything else. What Haynes did not know, what none of the 14 officers in that room knew, was that the 48 hours the British officer was asking for were not the beginning of something. They were the final interval of something that had already been running for 16 days. While 3 American assault operations sat classified and unresolved in task force records, while Haynes was writing rejection notes and scheduling formal briefings and managing the institutional architecture of a decision he believed was already made, 7 men had been in the field every night, in silence, within direct observation range of the compound that 3 forces had failed to enter. They were not waiting for permission to start. They had almost finished. 19 days. That is how long the SAS reconnaissance element had been operating in the vicinity of the compound before the January briefing ended, and Haynes said yes to 48 more hours. 16 days before that meeting. 3 more in the interval that followed. 19 days total, conducted entirely without the knowledge of the American command, without air support, without a forward operating base within immediate reach, and without a single incident that flagged their presence to the compound's 400 defenders. To understand what those 19 days produced, you have to understand what they required. The team did not approach the compound. Approaching the compound was precisely what 3 American assault forces had done, and 3 American assault forces had been detected and pushed back before reaching the outer wall. The SAS element did not approach. They settled. They identified 3 separate observation positions in the urban and semi-rural terrain surrounding the northern edge of the compound, positions that offered direct sight lines to different sections of the perimeter, concealed from both the guard towers and from the irregular foot traffic that moved through the area during daylight hours. They rotated between those positions each night, never using the same approach route consecutively, never establishing a pattern that a disciplined observer on the wall could track and anticipate. What they were building, night after night, was not a snapshot. It was a living record, a continuously updated map of everything that happened at that compound between last light and first light. Every patrol, every guard rotation. Every moment when a section of wall was covered and every moment when it was not. The timings were logged to the minute. The positions were mapped with distances measured by eye and confirmed by calculation. Nothing was assumed. Nothing was estimated when it could be verified. The standard they were working to was not the standard of a force that needed a general picture of the objective. It was the standard of a force that needed to move through that objective in the dark, at close range, against 400 men, with no margin for error and no ability to disengage cleanly once the entry was made. On the 11th night, something changed. It was not dramatic. It would not have registered as significant to anyone who had not been watching the same sector of the same wall at the same hour for 11 consecutive nights. But the team had been watching the same sector of the same wall at the same hour for 11 consecutive nights, and so they saw it clearly. Between 02A17 and 02A40, the northeast section of the outer perimeter had no human coverage. Not reduced coverage, not partial coverage, no coverage. The explanation, when it was reverse engineered from the patrol patterns over subsequent nights, was mechanical rather than intentional. A shift overlap problem in the guard rotation schedule that left the northeast sector in a gap between the outgoing and incoming teams. The outgoing team cleared the sector at 02A17 as part of their end-of-shift sweep. The incoming team did not reach that section of wall until 02A40 because their rotation path began at the south perimeter and moved clockwise, and the northeast was the last point on their circuit. 23 minutes. Not every night. On 2 of the 8 nights the team observed it, a supervisor walked an irregular check route that partially covered the gap. But on 6 of those 8 nights, the window opened and held for the full 23 minutes without interruption. 6 out of 8 nights was not luck. 6 out of 8 was a structural flaw in the rotation design, one that had existed long enough to become invisible to the people responsible for it, because nothing had ever come through it. Nothing had come through it yet. The team confirmed the window over 7 consecutive nights before the January briefing. They measured the wall height at the northeast section. They identified the terrain between the nearest approach position and the base of the wall, the distance, the surface, the noise profile at night, the sight lines from the nearest active tower at that hour. They calculated the time required to cross that distance, reach the wall, and breach it without triggering audio detection from the nearest interior patrol route. The numbers worked. Not comfortably, but they worked. What the 43-page dossier that the British officer delivered to Haynes on February 8th contained was not a revised plan. It was the documentation of 19 nights of evidence, patrol logs, rotation timings, position maps, wall measurements, approach calculations, and 7 nights of confirmed observations of the 23-minute window, cross-referenced and annotated, so that any trained officer reading it could follow the logic from the first page to the last, without encountering a gap or an assumption that was not supported by direct observation. 43 pages. Every number in it sourced to a specific night, a specific position, a specific time. But the reconnaissance was only one half of what made the plan viable. The other half was the 7 men who would execute it. The SAS selection process does not produce specialists in the conventional military sense. It produces operators capable of functioning at a high level across an abnormally wide range of roles: combat, intelligence gathering, demolitions, communications, medicine, surveillance, and the particular cognitive discipline of operating for extended periods in austere environments with minimal external support. The men selected for this specific operation were not chosen randomly from the available pool. Each of the 7 carried a primary function within the mission architecture that the other 6 could not replicate at the same level of competency: entry, neutralization, target extraction, perimeter security, communications, medical support, exfiltration. 7 functions, 7 men. There was no redundancy built into the assignment structure. In conventional military planning, redundancy is not optional. It is the difference between a setback and a catastrophe, because conventional operations account for the near certainty of some level of attrition. The SAS plan carried no redundancy because redundancy requires personnel, and additional personnel require a larger breach, a longer exposure window, a slower movement profile through the interior, and a higher probability of audio or visual detection at every stage of the operation. The 23-minute window did not accommodate a larger team. It accommodated exactly the team that was planned. If any one of the 7 was unable to perform his function, for any reason, at any point from entry to exfiltration, the plan did not have a fallback. It had an abort threshold, a set of predefined conditions under which the team would disengage and extract without the objective. But it did not have a way to compensate for a missing function. Each man knew this. Each man had been told this explicitly before the operation was submitted for approval the first time, in November 2004. None of them had asked to be replaced. That detail, the absence of any request for substitution across 3 submission cycles and 3 formal rejections, across 2 full months of waiting, does not appear in the 43-page dossier. It does not need to. It is the kind of fact that speaks without annotation. 7 men. 19 days of evidence, a 23-minute window in the northeast wall, and a team that had been ready since November, waiting for a colonel in a briefing room in Mosul to read 43 pages and reach the only conclusion the evidence permitted. On the morning of February 8, 2005, Colonel Richard Haynes read those 43 pages in 18 minutes. Then he approved the plan. The approval came at 09:43 on February 8, 2005. There were no ceremonies attached to it. Haynes signed the authorization document, set it on the table, and said nothing further. The British officer collected it, thanked him, and left the room. That was the entirety of the exchange. 18 minutes of reading, a signature, and a silence that carried the full weight of 2 months of institutional resistance collapsing into a single pen stroke. The team had the rest of February 8th to prepare. They did not spend it rehearsing. 19 days of direct observation had produced something more valuable than any rehearsal could replicate. A precise, internalized understanding of the objective that each of the 7 men had built through direct experience rather than through briefing documents or model reconstructions. They knew the northeast wall. They knew the approach terrain. They knew the 23-minute window not as an abstraction on a planning map, but as a lived reality they had watched open and close 6 times across 7 nights of observation. What February 8th required was not rehearsal. It was equipment check, final coordination, and rest. They were in position by 1:05 on February 9th. The approach to the northeast wall covered approximately 230 meters of mixed terrain, a section of broken urban fringe giving way to open ground in the final 60 meters before the wall base. The open section was the critical interval. It offered no cover, no concealment, and direct sightline exposure to the tower on the southeast corner during the first half of the crossing. The 23-minute window did not eliminate that exposure. What it eliminated was the human element at the northeast sector specifically. The tower remained manned, but its coverage arc, as documented across 19 nights, did not sweep the base of the northeast wall during the gap period. The crossing still required silence and controlled movement. It did not require invisibility. That distinction had been central to the planning from the beginning. At 02:14, the outgoing patrol completed its sweep of the northeast sector and moved off toward the south perimeter, exactly as it had on 6 of the previous 8 nights. The window opened. At 02:17, the team moved. 7 men crossed 230 meters of open and semi-open terrain in a controlled file formation, 5 meters between each operator, moving at a pace calibrated to minimize noise on the surface underfoot, without sacrificing the time margin the window required. The final 60 meters across open ground took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. No alarm, no contact, no deviation from the approach profile that had been calculated and recalculated across the final days of the reconnaissance phase. They were at the base of the northeast wall at 02:21. The breach took less than 3 minutes. The wall height at the northeast section was 3 meters and 40 centimeters, lower than the average perimeter height by approximately 60 centimeters, a structural inconsistency in the original Baathist construction that the reconnaissance had identified and measured precisely. The team was over the wall and inside the compound perimeter by 02:24, with 16 minutes remaining in the window before the incoming patrol reached the northeast section on its clockwise circuit. They did not need the 16 minutes. They were already moving into the compound interior. What happened between 02:24 and 05:20 was not a single continuous engagement. It was a sequence of distinct actions, each separated by intervals of movement through the compound's interior blocks, each requiring a different application of the team's capabilities. The compound was larger on the inside than its outer footprint suggested. The interior space was divided by internal walls and covered walkways into a series of functional zones. And moving between those zones without triggering a full defensive response required the same quality of deliberate, unhurried precision that had governed the approach. The first contact came at 02:51 in the corridor between the weapons storage block and the communications section. 2 armed fighters, both moving at a pace that suggested a routine internal check rather than a response to any detected threat. The engagement lasted under 4 seconds. No shots were fired that reached the compound's exterior. No alarm was raised. The team continued moving. The second and third contacts came within 11 minutes of each other, both in the transition zone between the communications block and the residential quarters where the rotating fighter population slept between duty shifts. Both were handled without triggering wider attention. The compound's interior noise profile, generators running, ambient movement of a 400-man population cycling through rest and duty at irregular hours, absorbed the brief sounds of each contact in a way that open terrain or a quieter objective would not have permitted. The compound's size, which had made it impenetrable to conventional assault, was working against its defenders in a way none of them had anticipated. 3 internal patrols were encountered and avoided entirely. No contact, no engagement, no deviation from the planned route. The patrol timings had been estimated from exterior observation and confirmed against interior movement patterns identified during the reconnaissance phase. Each of the 3 avoidance decisions was made in real time, but against a baseline of information detailed enough that none of them required improvisation. They required judgment. There is a difference. Abu Tariq al-Masri was located at 04H38. He was in the third interior block of the compound, the section the reconnaissance had assessed as the most probable residential and command area, based on the pattern of light activity and personnel movement observed over 19 nights. He was not in the position of a man expecting contact. He was not armed in a way that suggested immediate defensive capacity. What the team found was a man who had spent 11 months inside walls that everything surrounding him had confirmed were impenetrable, and who had organized his daily existence on the premise that impenetrability was a permanent condition rather than a condition that had not yet been correctly tested. He was taken alive. That had been the instruction from the beginning, and it was the outcome the plan had been designed to produce. An extraction under fire, through a compound with 400 armed occupants, would have transformed the operation into something unrecognizable. The entire architecture of the plan, the 19 days of reconnaissance, the 23-minute window, the 7-function team structure with zero redundancy, was built around the premise of a controlled extraction, not a contested one. The approach had to be silent. The contact engagements had to be contained. And the departure had to begin before the compound's defensive structure had time to register that something had changed. At 04H55, the team began moving toward the exfiltration route. They did not leave empty-handed. 2 laptop computers from the communications block, 3 portable storage units recovered during the movement through the interior, and a physical file, a bound archive of printed communications, handwritten ledger pages, and what appeared to be operational contact records, found in the same room as the target. None of those items had been listed as primary objectives. All of them were taken because the team had the capacity to carry them, and because 19 days of watching the compound had produced a clear enough picture of its communications function to make the intelligence value of anything originating from that block self-evident. The exfiltration route ran back through the northeast sector, through the same breach point used for entry. By 0600, all 7 operators were back in the open ground between the wall and the outer approach terrain. By 0621, the team crossed the exfiltration point with the target restrained, the materials secured, and every member of the 7-man element physically intact. 4 hours and 4 minutes. 11 combatants neutralized in direct contact across the compound interior. 3 internal patrols avoided without engagement, 1 high-value target captured alive, 2 computers, 3 storage units, and 1 physical intelligence archive recovered. 0 British casualties. 400 men had been inside that compound when the team crossed the northeast wall at 02:17. Not one of them had known the team was there until it was already over. The numbers were recorded in the Task Force After Action report filed on February 11, 2005. They were not contested by anyone who reviewed them. They were, in the precise language of that document, verified through multiple independent sources including operator accounts, signals intercept data, and physical evidence recovered from the objective. They did not require interpretation or context to carry their meaning. They were complete on their own. 7 operators, 4 hours and 4 minutes of total operation time, 11 combatants neutralized in direct contact across the compound interior. 3 internal patrols encountered and avoided without engagement. 1 high-value target extracted alive. 2 laptop computers, 3 portable storage units, and 1 physical intelligence archive recovered. 0 British casualties. Set those numbers against the alternative. The American plan that had sat in parallel development at the task force throughout January 2005, the plan that had been prepared as the contingency option in the event the British proposal was rejected permanently, called for 240 soldiers organized into 4 assault elements, 2 Apache gunships assigned to close air support, a signals intercept team, a dedicated medical evacuation unit, and a rapid reaction force of 60 Rangers positioned at a staging area 2 kilometers from the objective. The operational window was 72 hours, 3 full days allocated to breach preparation, assault, interior clearing, and extraction. The Task Force Intelligence Section had modeled the probable outcome at a 52% probability of successfully locating and capturing the target, not neutralizing the network. not recovering materials, capturing the specific individual. 52%, with 240 soldiers, 2 Apaches, and 72 hours. The British plan had used 7 men, 4 hours, and 19 days of silence, and had produced a result the American alternative could not have guaranteed at 5 times the force size. That comparison was not made publicly in February 2005. It appeared in internal assessments, in the margins of planning documents, in the quiet conversations that happen in headquarters buildings after operations that do not conform to any existing template. It was not the kind of comparison that institutions find comfortable, because the implication runs in only one direction, that the accumulation of resources, in this case, had not increased the probability of success. It had decreased it. 240 men require coordination. Coordination requires time. Time requires the objective to remain static. And a static objective against a 240-man force does not stay static. It responds, it adapts, it distributes its most valuable assets away from the point of pressure. Abu Tariq would not have been in that compound when 240 soldiers reached the outer wall. The 3 previous American attempts had already demonstrated that the compound's defenders were capable of anticipating approach profiles of exactly that scale. 7 men had no approach profile to anticipate. 7 men, moving in silence across 19 nights, did not generate the kind of signatures, communications traffic, vehicle movement, personnel staging, that a 400-man defensive force watches for. They were below the threshold of detection not because they were invisible, but because nothing in the compound's defensive calculus had been calibrated to look for something that small. The physical archive recovered from the communications block took 12 analysts 6 days to process in its entirety. What it contained exceeded every intelligence projection the task force had attached to the operation. The archive documented the full financial structure of Abu Tariq's IED network across the 3 northern provinces, Nineveh, Saladin, and Kirkuk, including the identities of couriers, the locations of material caches, the names and positions of the cell leaders operating beneath the network's upper tier, and the banking and transfer mechanisms that had kept the financing moving through 18 months of coalition pressure. It was, in the assessment of the task force intelligence chief, the most operationally complete picture of an AQI network structure recovered in the Northern Theater since the beginning of the occupation. In the 6 weeks following the February 9th operation, the intelligence derived from that archive generated 41 actionable secondary targets across the 3 provinces. 41 in 6 weeks. 11 months of satellite coverage, signals intercept data, and classified intelligence budgets running into the billions had produced a fraction of that number across the same geographic area. The archive did not just extend the operation's reach, it collapsed the network's operational capacity faster than any sustained pressure campaign had managed, because it bypassed the surface of the network entirely and struck the infrastructure that everything else depended on. Cell leaders were detained. Courier routes were interdicted. Cache locations were recovered. The financing mechanism that had sustained 140 deaths over 11 months was dismantled, transfer point by transfer point, within the first month after the operation. The network did not disappear immediately. Networks of that complexity do not collapse in a single sequence of actions, but it fractured. It lost the central coherence that Abu Tariq's direct management had provided, and it never recovered the operational tempo it had maintained through all of 2004. 140 Allied soldiers had been killed by devices connected to that network in 11 months. In the 11 months that followed the February 9th operation, the number attributed to the same network was 9. 7 men. 4 hours. 19 days of silence before that. The difference between 140 and 9 is not a statistic. It is the precise measure of what the plan that Colonel Haynes called operational suicide had actually produced. The official report was filed by Colonel Richard Haynes in March 2005. It was not a long document. It did not need to be. The operation had produced results that were self-documenting, numbers that required no narrative frame to communicate their meaning, that sat on the page with the particular weight of facts that have already decided the argument before anyone begins to make one. 400 combatants against 7 operators. 18 months of failed American assault operations against 4 hours and 4 minutes of British precision. 240 soldiers, 2 Apache gunships, and a 72-hour operational window against a 23-minute gap in a guard rotation that no one had looked for closely enough to find. 140 deaths attributed to the network over 11 months before the operation. 9 in the 11 months that followed. 52%. The American plan's projected probability of success at 5 times the force size against a mission that returned every operator, recovered the target alive, and dismantled the network's financial infrastructure across 3 provinces inside 6 weeks. Haynes wrote, in the formal language of an after-action report that would remain classified for years, that the British element's initial proposal had been correct in its methodology from the first submission, that the task force's 3 cycles of formal rejection had been based on a framework of assessment that measured force size against objective complexity, without adequately accounting for the operational value of sustained, low-signature reconnaissance. That the plan, as submitted in November 2004 and unchanged in its central architecture through 2 subsequent rejections, had been the correct plan from the beginning. His exact words in the summary section were these: "Our initial assessment was incorrect in every measurable aspect. The British plan was correct from the first draft." He signed it. The same signature that had authorized the operation on the morning of February 8th. The same hand that had written "Operational Suicide Committed to Paper" in his notes from the December review. There is no record of what he said when he filed it, or whether he said anything at all. There is only the document and the numbers inside it, and the silence that surrounds both. A fortress does not fall because of the size of the force that attacks it. It falls because of the size of the silence that precedes it.